All right, thanking God for the way in which he helps us overcome great disappointment. Let's call this chapter, Mark chapter 7, Great Disappointment, for a lot of reasons, but part of it because of the version or the description that Mark gives of the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, a demon-possessed girl, also described in Matthew chapter 15, Matthew chapter 15, I think, which heavily corresponds to Mark chapter 7. There she's described, however, as the Canaanite woman who gets a tough response from Jesus that does not deter her or discourage her from getting the healing that she seeks for her child in this chapter that, as we mentioned, roughly mirrors Matthew 15, starting out with the first, 13 verses or so, talking about traditions versus commandments, as we saw in Matthew 15, a group, this time from the Pharisees, but describing the scribes as having traveled all the way from Jerusalem to ask Jesus what seems to be a petty question. They will ask him, why did his disciples not wash their hands according to the traditions of the elders, giving him the opportunity to, as we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, correct the ways in which they had actually turned away from the commandments of God, here as he's going to describe it, in order to establish their traditions. And since we're retelling these stories, the highlight or the distinction that I see in Mark's description of the story comes in that phrasing that we see in verse 9, where it says, and he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. Super similar to what he's going to say in verse 12. And it's going to say, then you no longer permit him or a person who wants to take care of mother and father to do that because they're trying to establish their tradition, going more into motive than what we might have seen in Matthew, showing that, as I think will become significant later on, that they have a conscious intent to stray from the things that God has established for his people. Going on, though, in verses 14 through 23, he is going to let them know that it is not the foods that they can take in with unwashed hands that actually defile them, even though they can physically make you sick. That's my ad lib. The things that actually defile a person on a more significant level are the things that come out of the heart. Specifically in verse 21, he's going to say, for from within, out of the heart of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and they defile a person. The point I want to bring out of that as we go back through the theme of the chapter that stood out most to me. But from there, he's going to give us an interesting contrast in the story of the Syrophoenician woman called the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, who approaches him hoping that he will drive a demon out of her daughter. And in the spirit of emphasizing the contrast between what we've already seen in Matthew's description and what we will see here in Mark's description, he is going to respond to the woman who is a Gentile as he is traveling through the regions of Tyre and Sidon, that if they are still considered a part of Israel, are literally at this time, they are considered borderline Israel. And either way, he has come into contact with a Gentile woman, as we said, Canaanite in Matthew's description, Syrophoenician woman here. Either way, he is going to consider her outside of his mission at this point. Understanding that, he is going to say in verse 27, and he said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. We've emphasized that a number of times as being a harsh statement that does not deter the woman, but the difference that I saw in Mark's description is the fact that he says, let the children be fed first. He's more gentle in his ultimate response after her demonstration of faith in Matthew, but here he seems to be more optimistic up front, not giving her a statement that sounds like a flat out no, as much as he's simply talking about priorities, meaning that if she is willing to wait, then there's potentially hope. But she demonstrates a level of faith that convinces him to go ahead and help her out now. At which point verses 31 through 37 close out the chapter with the description similar to what we'll see in Matthew, where he will talk about the way in which he heals many and therefore his fame continues to grow, as chapter 8 will pick up, talking about once again the way that great crowds form, of course, because of the renown and the stories of what he is able to do to help people who are in distress. But it's going to build, or here he's going to tell the story of one great healing that seems to lead to the growth of the crowds, as opposed to simply generically saying that the collective, I guess, healings that he did and the compassion he showed to people was what attracted them. This one is going to describe the way in which he heals a deaf man, charging him to be silent. But as verse 36 notes, the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it, as we mentioned, leading to his fame spreading. And once again, in chapter 8, more great crowds in need of help. But the thing that might have most stood out to me in this chapter really extends from the second section, I think, that we broke it down into, or at least the ESV broke it down into. My descriptions is pretty much following their paragraphs again. In verses 14 through 23, when he describes what actually defiles a person, he says it's the things that come out of the heart. And he gives us a list of things, but we also can see that as an illustration within the stories of this chapter, where what seems to be really on the heart of the Pharisees is that motive that Mark takes time to detail, as opposed to what we saw in Matthew's description. And that is, they were seeking to establish their traditions to simply replace the law of God. Understanding that, that's an interesting contrast to the Syrophoenician woman who, even though he was going to tell her no, her humility is what seemed to be exposed in the rejection that she really could have taken offense at, being called, as we noticed in the past, a dog, essentially. And even though it is a humility born out of desperation, it's still an interesting contrast to what we saw out of those who were seeking to replace God, as opposed to those who were seeking help from God. Understanding that, we get to see in Jesus at the end of the chapter, in verses 31 through 37, what was coming out of him was a level of excellence that made the people notice in the last verse of the chapter, he has done all things well, meaning all things, reminding me of the great disappointment I've had in life and times when I've had the chance to meet famous people who I admire for their talents, only to get to see them personally and be disappointed by the fact that they weren't all that cool, nice, or approachable as people. Understanding that sometimes it can be just them in the moment. Being famous can, I'm sure it can be a burden. I wouldn't know from personal experience, but I do know that there are times when I have met people who are super talented, and in those moments when they were super approachable and super kind, that might have helped me understand a little bit of the impression Christ was leaving on these crowds when they said he has done all things well. Beyond his talent, once again, it seems that his level of completeness came in his great compassion for people, which seemed to give a level of significance, genuine significance to his talents. Something that more and more is going to seem to distinguish his work from that of the scribes, the Pharisees, chief priests, etc., especially as he marches on towards Jerusalem, as we see in this chapter, in their effort to establish their own traditions that they might have liked quite a bit, but traditions that were proving ineffective for the people, in contrast to the Christ who, in his compassion, was bringing a level of healing that was actually improving the lives of the people.